Today, Dr. Dawn Harper of the Channel 4 show Embarrassing Bodies will launch new research which looks at the effect inflammatory bowel disease has upon the lives of sufferers. Dawn joins us in the studio along with Victoria Power, who lives with Crohn's disease. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon.
Could I start with you, Dawn, just to kind of define the terms for people? Inflammatory bowel disease really, I suppose, is it takes within that a number of differing conditions.
Absolutely.
Does it?
It's an umbrella term, if you like, which incorporates Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis and forms of colitis. And what it really means is that you get an inflammation within the bowel. It's quite distinct from IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome, much more common condition, which again can be very miserable, but is generally speaking not as severe. So the inflammatory bowel diseases can cause quite a lot of crampy abdominal pain, bloating, often diarrhea. But what they have, which is different to IBS, is they often have blood in the diarrhea. And I think, you know, with my GP hat on, the message I want to get out there is that blood in your motions is not normal and must always be checked out. As you've mentioned, yes, I work on embarrassing bodies, and sadly I think bowels and bladders still do cause a degree of embarrassment. They shouldn't. We've all got them.
Yes.
And they do go wrong. So the real take-home message, if anyone out there is listening to this, that, you know, if you've had bloody diarrhea, you need to see your GP. Don't be embarrassed. You won't be the first, you won't be the last, and you certainly won't embarrass your doctor.
What tends to cause this inflammation?
Well, we don't really know exactly why. It does sometimes run in families, and we know that there is an immune mediation in it. So often the immune system is involved, and we use that knowledge to our benefit, because some of the pills that we use work on the immune system. Immune modulating drugs and steroids as well will help to treat the symptoms. So we're still, obviously there's always ongoing work looking at what is causing these things, because like everything else, once you know what's causing something, it's so much easier to cure it. So at the moment we don't cure Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, but what we can do is manage the symptoms. And as you've just mentioned, the survey out today, which has been commissioned by Abbott in partnership with the Irish Society for Crohn's and Colitis, and they have basically looked at people in 14 different countries in Europe, looking at the impact that these conditions can have on people's quality of life. And it is very important that anybody who has these sort of symptoms gets a diagnosis, because the earlier you get your diagnosis, the quicker you get on treatment, and the better the impact we can make in improving quality of life.
Victoria, when did you first start to notice?
About 11 years ago, I started getting symptoms when I was in French college. So I had when we say abdomen cramps, it's not just little cramps. It's like you're getting stabbed by 50 million times in your stomach. You're crunched over with pain. So I started getting that in the summer when I was about to go into my leaving cert. I wasn't too sure what was wrong with me. Like normal, most Irish people, I just got on with it. Went to the doctor, he said it was a virus. So I just kind of continued on, but then blood started appearing in my stools, my abdomen distended. I was getting mouth ulcers, chronic fatigue, pains in my joints. And so eventually when my mom saw my stomach, then I went to the GP, and then he referred me on to a consultant. So I was quite lucky in a way, because it takes quite a long time for diagnosis for some people. You get told it's in your head, you're anorexic. It's quite a battle to get diagnosed, but thankfully now there's a bit more awareness out there, and it's becoming more.
That's interesting that you had to go to the GP twice for them to even start to have a clue. Is that common, that the diagnosis?
It's certainly not uncommon, you know, the problem is that, as Victoria said, you know, the abdominal cramps and so on with inflammatory bowel disease can be really very severe. They can actually be with irritable bowel syndrome, and often you find that, just as Victoria found, you know, it was only when she had this sort of persistent distension and blood in her diarrhea that actually she was referred on to have an investigation. And when we have a little look with a telescope into the bowel of sufferers with Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, there are some really quite characteristic changes that help us to make the diagnosis. But sadly, it's not uncommon.
Yeah.
And then after the second referral,
yes,
were people around you, were many people even aware of Crohn's disease or what it was?
Well, I had never heard of the disease. Unfortunately, when you have symptoms, well, I know myself and a few other people, you kind of hide the symptoms because it's not something that you talk about. You're not saying to someone, "Oh, I've got diarrhea, I'm running to the loo, the toilet is full of blood," because it's just not a nice topic of conversation. You're tired, you're fatigued, you think, "Oh, maybe that's normal." You get used to it and you live with it, which is wrong, and that's why, as Dr. Harper said, you need to get to the GP. But I suppose I kind of covered up a little bit to an extent, and then obviously my mom and the family started noticing that there was something wrong. They thought I was bulimic for a while because they heard noise. I was going into the bathroom and they just thought I was getting sick, but that wasn't the case.
And then when you were referred, who you were referred to and what happened then?
Well, I won't say his name because I left him because he was horrendous. It was absolutely horrendous. I was 17. I got diagnosed over the phone by the receptionist. The doctor was probably golfing. He was on holiday for 3 weeks now. I know it's not always the case, but for me that was my story. So I was sitting at the kitchen table. My mom took the phone call and she said to me, "You've Crohn's disease." Didn't know what it was. Straight onto the internet, and the stories were, somebody had just died from it, and they weren't able to live their life. And at 17, I thought my life was over, which obviously wasn't the case when I went and educated myself and changed doctor.
Good God.
I know, but that, unfortunately, a lot of the cases, I did a manifesto in 2009, and there was about 10 of us in the room, and there wasn't one person that had an easy diagnosis. They were told they had to go to a psychologist, that they were anorexic, and they really had to push to be diagnosed, which is hard.
And when the diagnosis did come through, albeit by remote control, it sounded like, did they say, well, this is what we're going to do next? This is the treatments you're going to receive?
Unfortunately, I didn't get that much information. I was just put on drugs. I was put on steroids initially, and I was doing my leaving. My hands were shaking. I was getting palpitations. I couldn't sleep. I was green. And then obviously, as a young lady, the body image started. I got bloated, moon-faced, and it was so difficult. And I really had to educate myself at the time, 11 years ago. And I mean, I was only talking to someone the other day, and they came to one of our meetings for the Irish Society of Crohn's and Colitis, and she said to me, "Why are the doctors talking about long-term?" I said, "Because you have a long-term illness." She wasn't even aware she had a long-term illness with Crohn's or colitis. So that's why really the education and how it impacts your life is so important to get out there.
So then how long did it take before, if you like, for want of a better word, things stabilised for you and you were able to manage it?
Probably about 3 years, really. In and around, and I'm having a little bit of a flare-up at the moment. So it's an ongoing battle, and it's just adjusting your life, adjusting medication, learning your limits. If you're tired, if you can't get up, I mean, you really can't get up out of bed. You feel like you've been hit by a bus, and to know, no, don't get out of bed. Let your body relax. Listen to your body. And each individual with Crohn's or colitis knows themselves, as long with their doctor, and you have to kind of learn how to live with it. I know some people, they just were on Facebook there, and they were like, they don't leave the house until they go to the bathroom 20 times. 20 times before 6 or 7 a.m. in the morning.
In terms of your diet, are there yeses and nos?
For me individually, I do find that a gluten-free and a kind of dairy-free diet helps me. Again, everyone is individual, and some people will say, "Oh no, that's all I can eat." So it's really kind of getting a food diary and finding out what works for you or what doesn't work for you. What I did initially is I kind of completely detoxed, try and allow my body. Now this isn't going to cure you, but it's just going to help. It's like anybody, even if you have Crohn's or you don't have Crohn's. And so I just had my symptoms, had my food diary, and I said, okay, this agrees with me, this doesn't agree with me, and I reintroduced things then when I felt I was able to. But it's still a learning curve,
And how much does stress play a part?
Well, Dr. Harper will probably help me out there. I personally try and avoid as much stress as possible. The path I've gone down now is holistic treatments and complementary therapies. I was going to be a nurse, but I felt that environment was going to be too stressful for me. So I think it does. I think it does play a part in it, as does anybody. I mean, people get ulcers. If you get stressed, if something happens in your life, it just happened with the bowels that, you get problems then.
So it has had a fairly profound effect on what you're going to do with your life.
Absolutely, yeah. Some people, I was talking to another girl the other day, we had a youth day with the ICC, and she was 24 and she's had Crohn's since she was 4 years old. And I was talking about my travels. I'd gone to Australia and I'd done this and that, and she turned to me and she said, "You can travel." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "I've had Crohn's since I was 4. She said, "The furthest I've been is to Wexford because I didn't think I could travel with this disease."
Gosh.
So it really has an impact on people's life. People have to leave work. I know a few people in their marriages have failed because they've been diagnosed after they got married and the partners couldn't deal with the situation.
Wow.
So it really does have an impact.
And the survey seems to bear this out, especially from a professional point of view, that It's hard to explain to an employer if you're regularly missing days, and if you describe it, it could sound like, well, a bit of an upset tummy.
Well, we've all had diarrhea, haven't we? But to have the odd bout of diarrhea is something that will affect most of us at some point. The kind of symptoms that Victoria is describing are really very different, and I think there's a couple of really important points in your story, Victoria. Firstly, if you have persistent symptoms, just because you've been told it's one thing to start off with, go back and ask for help, because common things are common, and most of us that get a bout of diarrhea, it will be down to a virus, but it shouldn't persist. So if your symptoms persist, go back and tell your doctor. And the second thing is, the internet's here to stay, and we will all use internet for healthcare. I get Dr. Google in my consulting room at least once a week as a word of paper, and it can be very difficult as a layperson to know what's reliable advice and what isn't. And I think, for example, anybody who's listening to this conversation we're having now who wants more information, I'd say go to the ISCC website, which is simple, iscc.ie, and you'll get reliable information, because education is so much part of it. And sometimes you can get really frightening information if you go to the wrong places.
Speaking of Dr. Google, a few people have texted in questions, whether they've originated with Dr. Google or not, I don't know. Aileen says, do people with these problems absorb the right amount of nutrients? Along with with other problems, should they take vitamin supplements too? My cousin has this, and I'm worried she's missing out.
Really good question. People who have profound diarrhea from whatever cause may well not be absorbing nutrients. Now, I'm not a great fan of sort of blindly supplementing, but I think if you are things like Crohn's and UC make you feel absolutely steamrolled. Victoria's given a really clear story of that, and it can become your norm. But if you're feeling like that, I think it's important that you go to your GP, who can arrange some tests, because it's quite common to get, for example, iron deficiency anemia or some vitamin deficiencies as a result of the diarrhea. And if that is the case, then your GP needs to do two things. Firstly, change your treatment so that actually you're getting your symptoms back under control. But secondly, make sure that whatever deficiencies are addressed and your supplements are given to you.
Does alcohol or other foodstuffs exacerbate these conditions?
I think Victoria's story was very clear. There is no one specific food or food group that across the board will cause problems. But I think anyone with any bowel symptoms, I'm a great fan of keeping a symptom and diet diary, because sometimes it can be very difficult. Often with diet, the symptoms aren't immediate. They'll be a day or two afterwards. And it's only when it's written down that you can see very clearly what those patterns might be, and you will then notice what might trigger things for you.
Paul says the cause of inflammation is eating grains. Bread, pasta and oats, etc. should not be in anyone's diet. If you stop eating grains, IBS and other autoimmune diseases will disappear. We are simply not meant to eat grains.
Okay, well, I'll take a little bit of issue with that. I don't want to poo-poo what he's saying, in that he may well find that his symptoms have been better by excluding certain food groups. It's not true to say that you can treat autoimmune diseases by cutting out
grains. And also there's new babies being diagnosed with it, so they're not eating grains.
And the other thing to say is, if you are ever going to consider cutting out a whole food group for any length of time, you shouldn't be doing that without the advice of a nutritionist or a dietitian, so that you make sure that you're replacing the nutrients that are in that food group.
Victoria, was it hard for you to decide to go public with this, given that it is a subject that, because diarrhea is involved and stuff, and it's people get squeamish about it?
No, it wasn't hard at all, because when I met a few people back in 2009, and just the joy that we had from meeting each other, and we got so much out of that weekend, that we just said we have to help other people with this condition, because it's not an easy condition. It's very isolating, and just for people out there, if you have Crohn's or colitis or have the symptoms, you're not alone. There's a support group out there, and once you know what you have, and once you know, okay, I'm not a freak of nature, this is out there, is on the increase, it's okay. And I'd rather be out there and put myself out there and help other people, and that's all that matters. If that one girl goes travelling, well, then my job's done.
Yeah, indeed. Victoria and Dawn, thanks a million for coming in to talk to us today.